everyone. Just a bit of housekeeping. Again, I know we're running behind, but we'll only go 10 more minutes, and then we'll break for a little food and cafe visit. But I wanted, Ryan, I thought doing Being With was a great way of providing this conceptual thread, I thought, to help us think through some of these kind of exhibition issues as well. And I wanted Karen maybe to jump off from Ryan and just ask you about you talked about Bonnie kind of being with Portable Parks, this project with Howard Levine for 50 years. When you approached someone like Allison Knowles, what either excitements or resistances did they bring to the table? They've been with these pieces for so long. I've had some experiences with say, Joan Jonas, for instance, who never wanted to look at an older piece. And her solution to being with is, I'll be with the thing and make an entirely new piece that has an old element of the piece you wanted me to do, but I'll take it forward. So maybe talk a little bit about how those two different artistic examples. You should have a mic right behind you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, if you could pick two more opposite people in the universe, they would be Bonnie Sherk on one end and Allison Knowles on the other. Because Bonnie is someone who was always very hyper-focused about, she's messianic. She was getting the word out about her mission. She was very concerned about every detail about how something was done. So the good news about Bonnie is she embraced it, she was excited, she loved the fact that she could be an artist in residence at Otis and put those students to work. But as you saw from the photos, she did get in there herself and she did do some of the work, but of course she was commuting. She was all in, and really the issues were, I think, managing expectations, because her vision is always so big and we had a certain amount of time to do it. But we did do a Kickstarter campaign. Remember Kickstarter? And the beautiful landscape, the garden plot was blown up into a poster. That was our freebie. And we actually got we raised a fair amount of money from Kickstarter. So Bonnie is all hands on deck, right? Allison would not have an archive if she hadn't had a lifelong partner in Dick Higgins, who was so attentive to saving everything, because she is the most zen of the Fluxus practitioners. She just thinks of things in the moment. She would never think of keeping a handwritten score. I mean, she would produce it in a book, but she didn't keep paper. And in fact, it's really interesting because, people don't think she has an archive, but she really does. It just took a long, long time to pull things together, because she also, she's very, very, because she had been a master printmaker in the true sense of having worked as a commercial printer, because she was also a writer, a poet, she's very attentive to text, she's very attentive to design, but she just doesn't care about all those things. So for Allison, and of course Allison's at a very advanced age now, so Allison participated in everything very willingly, and she does mandate that if you show certain pieces, you have to do performances. So there's kind of a tacit understanding that you will convene a group of students, a group of artists, or people in-house, or audience members to enact scores. And for Celebration Red, she participated herself. She also did little, she played in the Beans and did stuff. But she's 90 years old now. So, but she was very enthusiastic. But she just in her life is not someone who saw this as being important. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah. And it makes me, Tanya, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but you brought up the Living in the Forest, the kind of two iterations, and so I wonder if maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. The SF MoMA version was a Suzanne Foley exhibition, and I'll let all of you know, one of the things I kind of as the outside producer was pushing on Tanya, I was like, well, we should cover Living in the Forest. I'll get you Christmas trees. At Fort Mason, we don't have the issues that a museum does. I was like, I don't want the animals, but I can give you the botanicals. And you were like, absolutely not. and we just never had that conversation. So maybe give a little bit of insight there, either about that first iteration in the gallery, and then why you were really certain, like, let's not do those.
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think with Bonnie's work, there was already a number of, especially more recent shows where Bonnie had digitized for publications and for, in some cases, to print. You know, she'd send files to Italy and they would then print, you know, diagrams or photos. So there was, for example, sort of the final room is a nod to a larger installation called A Living Library is Cultivating the Human and Ecological Garden, and very specific information on file about not only the image files, but here's the colors, here's the framing, here's, you know, how you do it. And with some of the earlier work that she hadn't had a more recent opportunity to show, there just isn't that kind of roadmap or even permission. And I think sometimes there were moments in the show where it was very clear, oh, this is a wonderful work on paper, we can just reframe it or frame it for the first time. Here is you know, an artist book that I had been asking about that I was very grateful for. Darlene Tong's performance anthology is the only reason I knew about it, because it was among the many publications that were cited at the time. But then when it came to some of these ambitious installations, both Living in the Forest and a larger one that she did for the ICA London with Lucy Lepard, you know, we have some slide photos. I was able to then figure out, oh, okay, these, you know, these photos are the ones that were pinned to the wall for SF MoMA, or here are the ballet shoes that she used for the balance part of the demonstrations of Akin logic, balance, compromise, devotion, etc. But there wasn't that same, what do you do with someone whose handwriting was so key or whose own animals were key? There are artists who have, especially with sort of living material, and I think of the Harrisons, for example, where there was both a diagrammatic sketch as well as then installations now that through, you know, working with a gallery in our state, one could arrive at showing. Living in the Forest maybe can be shown, but it was just, there just wasn't that, this is how you're gonna do it. And so what is that line between what the piece was and something that feels more like an immersive way to show documentation? So I ended up showing, also with this space, a video Bonnie had chosen to make with her narration. But there is a lot more footage of the piece. You know, one could think of it, maybe if it was its own installation. But that was some of the kind of challenge, are the works that were really also about her own, you know, sort of, they were layered. They weren't just, some of her earlier pieces were these, like, as she called them, still lives or tableau vivants, where you can get quite a bit of information just from the single image. Those later installations don't have that yet.
Yeah. If I could just bring Ryan in really quickly, just to, because Ryan, you know, you kind of work across a divide that is not always crossed, which is more performance work based in visual culture and galleries, and then also more theater based work. And I was happy you showed the Doggy Hamlet still, not only because I took my family to see Doggy Hamlet in Philadelphia, which was an interesting family outing. But it made me think too, seeing it in Philly, because it was in Fairmount Park, it was, you know, on a particular slope, that just how difficult that piece must have been, because every site you go to must be entirely different than the next one, you know. So you're trying to deal with ideas of a script or a score, right? And that's often the distinction between these kind of two domains. And so I'm just wondering, like, having been in these as artists and also now teaching, and you're teaching artists and you're teaching performers, how are you feeling about kind of being with repetition, ephemera, history when you're teaching these pieces, or building a new one?
That's a great question. I I was thinking back to one of the slides that you showed from the Fluxus works, in the spirit of Fluxus. And I think that's one of the hardest things, is actually in thinking about some of the histories that we've inherited or building or drawing experimental emergent methods from for creating dynamic things we might call performance or something, is actually how do we channel a certain spirit, or how do we channel a certain attitude? And that's difficult. And that's something that you don't necessarily get immediately from maybe a piece of ephemera. But the way in which you maybe display, the way in which you activate it, the way in which you teach it, maybe there's a way to kind of channel that. And I hope that my classes feel like that. I hope that the ways in which we work together in studios feels like that. And there is a kind of blurring. I feel like one of the things that I've inherited from like the sort of historic and neo avant-garde is this blurring of art and life. And that's tricky, because you also have an institutional context, or you have a museum context, you have a theater context in which there's protocols and safety issues and so on and so forth. But and we're working under capitalism, and so there's other kinds of frameworks and whatnot. You can't just sort of
Santa Monica Mall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But trying to stay with it's trying to stay with the students, or trying to stay with an idea, or trying to stay with a history. I think especially when it comes to histories and practices of the avant-garde, let's say, the neo avant-gardes, trying to invoke that spirit. And here in this back room, the last class that I taught in this building was a class called God Only Knows Who the Audience Is, which is based off of the video zine from La Mamelle. The title was pulled from that, and it was around Bay Area conceptual performance. And one of the things that we did was re-perform or try to reenact a number of these Bay Area conceptual performance works from the 70s as drawn from performance anthology. But the idea of not trying to do them exactly, but to try to something about them that would provoke or encourage a new response, so that something like that spirit could be channeled through. So something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's also so interesting is like the information we have, but then sometimes just even going through an archive or knowing an artist over time, the sort of different reads of work. I mean, there's really sort of iconic pieces. I think of, for example, with Terry Fox, a piece called Levitation at the Richmond Arts Center, which was actually it was sealed off, and this was earth that was taken from when the Army Street Interchange was being created, in a piece that the artist sort of privately performed, but I've always just seen it as an image, and so it's so easy to read it as, oh, everyone saw this piece, everyone knew it, and so these also lines for many of these artists between very personal works that they were doing, or sometimes just seen by a few, and others that then were either more public facing, or they were sending out documentation. And we had a conversation about, with Bonnie, her sort of written works on paper, sometimes with these wonderful stickers of her proposals, how many of the ones we didn't know about were sort of just speculative. And then there's a letter in the archive to Willoughby Sharp, and I don't know if this was for a magazine pitch, but she's sending different photos, and then she says, oh, and I have this idea to tether a lion between the two concrete lions of the De Young. And so it was like, here I just thought, oh, possibly this is just, like a whimsy as part of the era of portable parks and some of these other things. And it was like, no, I think she meant business.
She wasn't kidding.
Tanya, you bring up a really important point, because, when Alan Caprow had his non-retrospective retrospective at MoCA, one of the things that happened was there was a whole festival of reinventions of his work. And Paul McCarthy and Simone Forti and a few other people produced 18 happenings in 6 parts at LA Contemporary Exhibitions. How many of us went through art history classes looking at the same 3 images of Alan Caprow's work at the Rubin Gallery, and none of them ever show the fact that there were chairs for the audience, that you sat in chairs, and each of the different parts, the audience moved from chairs to the next space. I mean, photos lie. I mean, there's so many performance documents that have become now iconic that have not little, but they don't tell the full story of the originary moment. And that's what's kind of the interesting conundrum with Fluxus, because Fluxus was never, unlike Caprow, meant to be done a certain way. They weren't scripted in a way that, and they were more theatrical, and they were, happenings, not Zen-like koans. And, the whole point of Fluxus was anyone could do it. It didn't have to be an auteur, director like Alan Caprow. So, I think it depends on what the form of performance is, but it is really true that we have these stereotypes in our head, or these memes that don't necessarily match up with how something was. So the spirit is hugely important to get to that kind of evocative spirit.
I'm going to have to stop us there. I apologize. So we can take one question. I see one. Go ahead.
I was curious about how connected the farm was to the 200 communes that existed in San Francisco when the Cauliflower existed in the intercommunal network, the newspaper. Do you know much about that?
Yes. So Bonnie was not a communard, but there were a number of members or people who were involved with Crossroads community, the farm, who had been involved with the Diggers in particular, others who I think were with Black Bear. And so I think that, whether it was, and also with Jack Wickard having been involved in meme troops. So there was a larger sort of diverse communities of people who are also using, in some cases, also the performing arts, but also, certain ethos and principles from looking at the environment, from organic gardening, and bringing that into a lot of the activities. So it was a key part of the farm, but the farm itself was not it was not a commune. So that was a little bit of, maybe one of the ways it was distinguished from other groups.
Go ahead.
Ryan, why didn't you bring your dog?
He's hanging out with his friend Layla. They're best friends, and I don't know. They're having a good time in Vancouver right now. The what?
I said, hanging out with friends is important.
Hanging out with friends, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Thanks, everyone.